So first of all, thank you very much for the presentations. I'm gonna, as you can see, there is no slides for a number of reasons. The first reason is I thought that by this time of the day it would be close to death by PowerPoint, so I would try to avoid this. And also because given the quality of the speakers before, I wanted to make sure that I could address also and not repeat everything that had been said before. And because a lot of the things that I had planned to say have actually been said before, I'm glad I did not prepare lots of slides. So let's try to jump right into it, and I'm going to try to keep that lively to make the digestion not too hard. The title of the talk is How is NGO Perspective and how do we leverage all this information and the work that is being done for better policy? The first element of this, and because I'm a lawyer, I'm going to be paying some attention to what terms mean, let's try to define what do we mean by better policy exactly. And I think the previous speaker just made it clear that better policy can mean a lot of different things. So for us, the way we see this is better policy means policy that puts ecosystem health, and human rights at the core and at the center of what is trying to be done. And why is that? It's not only because we're all tree huggers and wildlife lovers, which some of us are, but that's kind of beside the point. It's because all of the studies that have been published and made for the past 40 years show that our current production and consumption levels and patterns are unsustainable. And when the word sustainable and unsustainable has been used a lot. So maybe we want to also understand what do we mean exactly by unsustainable. And by this, I want to make clear that I don't mean ticking the box sustainable development for some development plans, etc. What we mean by saying anything that is not putting ecosystem health, and human rights at the center is unsustainable. I mean it in the very literal sense of the term. It cannot continue. It is not viable to continue. And what is the it that cannot continue and that cannot move forward? It's our modern civilization as we see it, that is based on extractive. And beyond that, it's also very likely our very species. The impacts on reproductive toxicity, the non-communicable diseases, makes it that at the rate that we're currently producing stuff, extracting material, and consuming stuff, it will all stop. There will be no future and there will be no way forward. And that is very critical if we want to continue and if we want to move beyond that. So better policy is what gives us a chance. What gives my daughter a chance, your kids, and you to actually have a world in which they can thrive, in which they can have access to water, access to food, and to some level of dignity, at least as good as ours, hopefully. Now, this is a little gloomy thought, right? This is a little not very encouraging. So from there, we're going to try to transition this to also what is the link between what I've just describing and the upcoming wall that we're accelerating towards currently, and what is the link between what we discussed today, between phthalates, between material, between circular economy. And for this, I want to take the example of plastic. And why plastic? Because plastic is a symptom of the unsustainable way of our consumption and production pattern. We've heard today a lot about the possible impacts of some components of the plastic and what it does or what it could do to you as a user, what impacts it could have once you dispose of it. But it's important, as was highlighted by the previous speakers, to look at plastic in a full life cycle perspective. From the extraction of fossil fuel to create the plastic, and now the vast majority of plastic is made of fossil fuel and even more of fracked gas. So from the extraction of fossil fuel that spills out vast amount of toxic chemicals from the EPA's very evaluation, and God knows the US EPA are not green freaks like we are. They've identified over 170 known carcinogenic chemicals that are being emitted into the atmosphere. That's before the very idea of plastic is even out there. Then you need to transform that into plastic. You need to transport it via pipeline, then you need to refine it, you need to crack the ethane and refine it to produce all the wonderful chemical additives that we've been talking about. And this manufacture happens in those so-called infamous cancer alleys in Louisiana, in Texas, in some of the places in Northern Europe, in the Gulf. These processes use and release massive amount also of toxic chemicals. Some of those chemicals that are like benzene, for example, that is a known poison for bone marrow for over a century. And that is, again, we don't even have a plastic duck yet or a plastic wrapping for a food. We're just slowly getting there. Then when we're moving to the use and the consumer phases, we've heard today about the phthalates, a number of, but we need to integrate also the flame retardant, the toxic metals, the POPs that go into the actual products and that are being emitted in indoor air when we use it, outdoor, when they're being also used or discarded. Then we move to the disposal stage. And just to remind everyone, I'm sure everybody's familiar with the figure, but of the plastic that we produce today and of the plastic that we've produced until now, about 9% is recycled. Downcycle is a better term, but let's leave it out there. So about 9% is recycled, about 11 to 12% is incinerated, and the rest, well, the rest, it's complicated because the rest, most of it either goes in the environment in the form of litter, goes in landfill, which eventually will leach out in the environment, or is open burned. And that creates massive amount of greenhouse gases, as well as a lot of toxics that go out. So if you look at the full picture of the life cycle, the whole life cycle is an important threat to our climate balance, to our health, and in that they represent a good epitome example of how unsustainable our current production and consumption pattern of plastic is. So what is the trend in terms of plastic production? We're probably going to produce less and less, right? Yeah, I can see you all smiling. You know the answer to that question. Of course not. We're actually planning to increase the production of plastic of about 30% by 2025. There are currently, in the US alone, $204 billion being invested in new pipelines, new ethane crackers, new infrastructure to produce more virgin plastics. So let's take plastic as an example, and let's try to see, or let's understand why we believe that better policy, what better policy means around of plastic, and go to the title of the presentation, which is how. How can we all together are going to do this? Now, I have to give you a little disclaimer or spoiler alert about what comes next in the rest of the talk. I am not going to give you a silver bullet solution. There is no two-stage process that can be implemented to address the issues that I've just described. So I'm going to look at it for a more systemic, try to be a little more systemic and try to take a step back. And I'm going to talk to you from an NGO perspective, but also I'm a lawyer by training. I come from an organization that is called CIEL. It's the Center for International Environmental Law. And when I was preparing for this conference, I thought, okay, who's going to be in the audience? There's going to be quite a lot of scientists. And interestingly, scientists and lawyers have one thing in common. Well, we have many things in common. For the first part, the rest of the world doesn't understand how clever we are. But apart from that, we have other things that are a connection between lawyers and scientists. Both lawyers and scientists know that there are such things as yes and no questions. But both lawyers and scientists know that these questions hardly ever tell the whole story, because there's a lot of other things to be talked about. And we know that it's a lot about what kind of questions we're asking. And we know that part of this process revolves around uncertainty. And uncertainty is present at every stage of the work that we do. I would almost argue that uncertainty is at the core of the scientific method. This is what you guys scientists do. You ask new questions that leads to new questions. You create knowledge that raise new questions. As lawyers, we try to do this with a more close loop, but generally it's the same thing. There is a question of uncertainty. And so at the heart of the question of how do we address this problem, my point is, at the heart of the question is, how do we deal with uncertainty as a society and in each of our professions? And importantly, to get there, how do we communicate about uncertainty? I heard today in a number of talks this morning, and you've read this hundreds, if not thousands of times, there's a need for more research. We need more data. But more research and more data for what? When do we decide that we know enough, that it's time to act? How do we define a threshold for this? And to be fair, it's almost impossible. Thresholds will be different for different populations. It'll be different for different materials, for different kinds of cycles. So again, I'm not going to give you one value of 12 or whatever number. That could be what the threshold is for when we know enough. But I would propose as an idea or thought for you to reflect on that. The way you define thresholds, or the way you identify a good threshold of when to act, when do you know enough to act and to do what, is by combining knowledge and values. Because knowledge without value is interesting, but not really useful. And similarly, values without knowledge doesn't allow you to actually take any sorts of decisions or informed decision or the good kind of decision. So my proposition to you is, how do we do this? By letting values infuse the work that we all do as scientists, as lawyers, as regulators, our industry, etc. So I want to finish briefly with a few points or few recommendations. The first thing is, because it's impossible, like I said, to have just one simple solution to address this question of plastic, I would suggest that there is a need to act everywhere, at the very local level, national, regional, global level, and global level also because the supply chains of everything that we consume and that we use today, almost everything, is global. Again, the plastic, the ethane gas is extracted in Pennsylvania. It is then shipped to Antwerp or northern England to be turned into a particular polymer. This polymer will be exported to China or somewhere else to manufacture a plastic duct that itself will travel around the world. So there are very few things that we can do at national level. But that doesn't mean that the national level is not useful. Similarly to trying to act at all level, we want to try to have an impact at every not just stage of the life cycle, but in every aspect of the consumption pattern, from demand to offer. And it is critical that we need to address also the offer element, because, as I was mentioning before, because we're producing more and more plastic, we can all decide that we want to stop using plastic bottles. If we produced 100 additional million tons of plastic a year compared to what we produced 5 years ago, it's going to be produced. It's going to be out there. And as I mentioned before, 9% of it is going to be downcycled, 10% of it is going to be incinerated, and the rest is going to be here for many, 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 many generations to come. So the only, I want to say realistic, but I understand that it is a little tricky word to use, but the only realistic way to look at this problem is to also look not only at how we can reduce demand by putting bans on certain single-use products and other, but also trying to reduce offer, trying to reduce the production. Now that is quite ambitious, you would tell me, but again, that is the only way that we can have a chance to actually create something that is sustainable, to create a world, I was going to say a better place, but at least a place that is at least as good as what we have today, because we're not going in this direction so far. So what is our role to each of us? And I try to think of possible call, I was going to say recommendation, but they're not recommendation, because who am I to make recommendation to anyone, but call to all of the different sectors that are represented today in this room. To scientists, I would say, don't be afraid to let your values show and guide the work that you're doing, because it is very important to produce more knowledge that will increase the knowledge. But again, if this knowledge is not connected to the values, to what you think is needed for us as a society or as a species, we need you to also let these values infuse the work that you do. To the regulators, I would say, learn from 200 years of industrial development and 50 or 100 years of modern risk assessment, and learn when we failed, where we haven't acted early enough. Learn where you keep on hearing talks about precaution, but precaution, it's not so good for growth, it's not so good for innovation, and it prevents us from coming up with a solution that will address the problem. I don't know of any substance, product, or ideas that was prevented to reach the market because of precautionary policies that were put in place. However, I and you probably know of a number of examples of substances that created massive impacts on health and the environment because we were afraid to actually use precautions and to take decisions around precaution, from asbestos to benzene to PCBs or others. To industry, I also say, just like as I did to the scientist, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to change. Change is natural, and as we heard from H&M earlier today, you can actually benefit from it. And the example from H&M was one, but an even better and I'd say example that is more fitting to the example they used today is look at ozone-depleting substances. 30 years ago, the world realized, wait a minute, we're pumping out substances out in the atmosphere that are destroying the ozone layer and that are creating an actual threat to our capacity to thrive on this planet. What did we decide to do? We decided to stop and ban the production of those substances or greatly limit them. And it worked. This slide before showed you all sorts of indicators, and all of them were going up. The only one that is going down is the one for ozone-depleting substances, because we put a treaty in place that actually works. But what's interesting for this point is that the companies, the industries that produce the HFCs greatly benefited from it, because they got financial support to do the transition, and they were the early entrant on the market for all the replacement. So there was actually massive amount of money to be made in just changing the way we think about different material cycle systems and impacts. And then finally, to my NGO colleagues, I would encourage us all to continue to engage with all of the other stakeholders, understanding where do they come from? What are their constraints? Very often, we're in a position where we want to work with scientists because we understand that they have data that is powerful, but we get frustrated because they don't say what we want them to say, because they don't say what we think they need to be saying. That is critical for us at NGOs to understand what is the scientific method? What are the environment in which each of the people we work with and speak to are in? No, it's important, and it's just as key. I mean, it's this. Yeah, so it's really, let's understand where they come from, what are their constraints, and how we can work with them and better create the synergies. And also, keep on mobilizing the population, keep on sharing the information, keep on sharing your analysis, and keep on being upfront and transparent about your values and about what you understand is needed for society's evolution. Because we heard it today, everybody seems to understand that something needs to happen, but it will only happen if the population, the people's pressure is strong and hard enough. So those are some token points reflection on what we heard today and some of my experience before, and how we can do to actually all work together, not to solve the problem, because I don't believe in easy solution, but to create the synergies that will actually allow us to think possible solution in the way they need to be thought, and not just jump from one problem to the next or one nasty chemicals to the next. Thank you very much.